Hello and welcome everyone to the second webinar of the Barnett Legacy Project series. I'm Josh Lambier, the Director of the Public Humanities at Western and the Artistic Director of the Words, Literary and Creative Arts Festival. And I'm coming to you live from Western University here in London, Ontario. As we gather together today virtually, weathering these very unusual and pandemical times, I also want to situate us in the territory on which this event is zooming to you from near and far. Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water and vital contributors to our community. I'm zooming to you not too far from Dishkanzibing, or the Thames River, which is flowing very fast these days after hard flooding rains here in London. Our series, the Barnett Legacy Project, takes its name from the visionary bibliophile John Davis Barnett, who in 1918 donated his personal collection of over 40,000 books and pamphlets, one of the largest collections in Canada at the time, to develop the emerging library at Western University. His only condition for the donation was that every page be available, to use his words, to any earnest seeker of knowledge. Our series of talks, which will happen all year round, so there'll be more to come as we go through the school year, honor that century-old pledge by extending the reach of our collection here further than Barnett might have ever even imagined. We're very grateful to Western Archives and Special Collections and their amazing team of folks for making this series possible for us. Though Western Libraries has an internationally recognized collection of rare books and special collections, most of these resources are only available to those who access them in person. Our series of talks in the Barnett Legacy Project seeks to bring treasures and gems of that collection to national and even international audiences with events like this one. Our speaker today, Ian Ray, is an associate professor in the Department of English, French, and Writing at King's University College. He is the author of the monograph From Cohen to Carson, the Poet's Novel in Canada, and the editor of George Bowering, Bridges to Elsewhere. I understand some of his students are here with us this afternoon. Welcome to all of you and for joining us here. And I must also note how profoundly Ian has championed the preservation and investigation of the Barnett collection with the scholarly community, but also with a broader audience. We're very grateful to him for being with us today to talk about how Barnett helped found the Stratford Festival. Ian, warm welcome to our webinar series.
Right, thank you very much, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have access to a broader audience than I normally would have via the internet and the Public Humanities series. So can everyone hear me so far? Am I audible, Josh?
Yes, you are. You're good to go.
Great, good to know, good to know. So my talk picks up where Scott Schofield and Blake Robertson left off in their July presentation in this series, wherein they outlined their efforts to construct a detailed and open database of approximately 12,000 volumes of Shakespeareana in the John Davis Barnett collection at Western University. For those of you unfamiliar with the Barnett collection, let me share my screen, which is hopefully now visible, and fill you in on some of the broad outlines of Barnett's reputation and also the particularities that I want to address today. As Josh mentioned, Barnett is best known for donating approximately 42,000 books on diverse subjects to Western University in 1918. The Barnett donation was particularly crucial for Western because, as Ruth Davis writes in her MA thesis on the formation of Western's early library, the university experienced a series of funding crises after its founding in 1878 that caused the suspension of the arts faculty between 1885 and 1895 as well as the failure of the London Law School in 1886. Davis notes that no direct financial support was given by the province, which is responsible for education under the Constitution, to Western, or at least to the departments of arts or medicine at Western, until 1914, because prior to the First World War, the provincial government sought to centralize post-secondary education in Toronto. The historian Fred Landon, who brokered the donation with Western, and who was himself an early Bachelor of Arts graduate, recalls that Western's revived arts faculty was still so poor during the First World War that it frequently could not pay its professor salaries, and it conducted its classes in rented rooms, mostly at Huron. Similarly, Tallman and Tallman observe in their history of Western that the underfunded arts faculty was so poor during the First World War that it only had a few hundred scattered books in study rooms and professors' offices. There wasn't properly an arts library, nor had there ever been a significant recorded gift to the arts library. Thus, as Mary Turner observes, Barnett's donation meant that the school, which could not afford to give Dr. Frederick Banting assistance to carry on his research in insulin, and thereby lost a Nobel Prize winner, bought a collection worth hundreds of thousands and paid for it with a smile. The Barnett donation instantly transformed London, Ontario into a major research destination for scholars in the humanities. And when the first national census on university libraries was taken in 1931, roughly a decade after, a little bit more than a decade after the Barnett donation, Western ranked 5th in Canada in library holdings, with McGill University in Montreal at the top, followed by the University of Toronto, Université Laval in Quebec, and Queen's University in Kingston. Some of the impacts of Barnett's donation are therefore quantifiable. I mean, we can and should count Barnett's books, particularly in an age that questions the value of libraries, of book collections, and even of books themselves. And so, the legacy of Barnett's books is not simply the books themselves, but also, importantly, the arts building, later renamed University College, that figured so prominently in the early campus in the 1920s, and more recently, for example, in various logos and pieces of letterhead that issue from Western. So we should note these impacts as humanities scholars. And I applaud Scott and Blake's database work. In fact, Alicia Robinet at Brescia and myself have begun to mirror it by preparing an inventory of Barnett's Canadian literature holdings. And these holdings can only really be identified by Barnett's accession book and by his distinctive bookplate, which is still found in books all over the Western library system. Although Barnett's Shakespeare collection is perhaps the most pertinent to my talk today, we should not forget that Barnett collected widely in Canadian literature and history, and that he was an honorary co-president of the Canadian Club in London, that he compiled the first bibliography that I'm aware of for literature in London, Ontario, and that one of the several obituaries for Barnett in the London Free Press hailed him as a great figure of Canadian literature. As I will illustrate later in my talk, Canadian and Shakespearean were not necessarily opposed or mutually exclusive terms for Barnett and his peers in Stratford, as they sometimes are in theater criticism on the Stratford Festival. For now, let us recall with Landon and Turner that after the province struck a provincial commission on university finances in 1920, the commissioners Sir John Wilson and Canon Cody toured Western, and they could hardly be drawn away from the library, Landon tells us, with all its beauty and wealth of information. This is quoted again in Turner. Davis also notes that the subsequent report of the Royal Commission pointed out the urgent need of better accommodation for the arts department of Western University, and the commission recommended a capital grant of $800,000 for building purposes, roughly 4 times the sum that the medical school was offered as a result of the same report in 1922. Most of the subsequent capital grant went to the construction of Western's signature arts building, later renamed University College, as I mentioned. So those of us in the humanities should certainly track these impacts, but the notion that Barnett somehow had an impact or influence on the founding of the Stratford Festival, as the title of my talk suggests, is a bit more problematic from a methodological perspective. There doesn't seem to be any direct correlation or quantifiable link between Barnett and the founding of the Stratford Festival in 1953. That's nearly 3 decades after his death. In fact, there's barely a trace of Barnett in Stratford at all. Temporary exhibitions about Barnett have been mounted by Stratford-based archivists such as Betty Jo Belton at the Stratford Perth Archives and Tom Belton and Robin Kierstead at Western. In 1985, a local history teacher at Juliet Public School in Stratford initiated a campaign that led to a bronze plaque commemorating Barnett being placed on a granite boulder in front of his old house on Durrow Street in Stratford, but it has since been removed. In 1981, the Healy portrait, which you might be familiar with at the back of the reading room at Special Collections at Western, the Healy portrait of Barnett appeared in an exhibition on British painting at Gallery Stratford, the main art gallery in Stratford, with a description of Barnett as a local cultural hero. However, this grandiose claim isn't matched by the attention paid to Barnett in local histories. Barnett gets a 1-page profile in the municipally sponsored History of Stratford by Adelaide Leach, Flood Tides of Fortune from 1980, and 2 pages in Dean Robinson's Railway City Revisited, the 2012 history of the steam locomotive repair shops in Stratford that Barnett, as a civil and mechanical engineer, supervised for decades. Importantly, Barnett is never mentioned by Tom Patterson, the honorary founder of the Stratford Festival, in his 1987 memoir, First Stage, The Making of the Stratford Festival. And yet, as MJ Kidney noted at the end of Scott and Blake's talk, it doesn't seem possible that it could just be a coincidence that the largest private collection of Shakespearean in Canada happened to reside for decades in the same city that would later found the largest classical theater in North America. And I agree, MJ, it doesn't seem like a coincidence, particularly since Barnett did not hoard his collection secretly in bank vaults like his contemporaries Henry and Emily Folger of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. Instead, Barnett operated a kind of private research institute out of his modest home in the city's East End, known locally as the House Held Up by Books. Fred Landon frequently visited Barnett in Stratford, and he does not seem to be exaggerating when he says that had Barnett kept a visitor's register, it would have recorded some of the outstanding scholars of this continent during the last half century. Extensive also was the correspondence which came from investigators seeking assistance. For a generation, Dr. Barnett provided a reference service that was unique. Certainly, regional newspapers touted the Barnett Library in Stratford as a quote-unquote mecca, a term that often gets used for Shakespeare scholars or for scholars in general. Indeed, the first mention that I found of Barnett contemplating a donation to Western occurs in 1913, when a report circulated in the Buffalo Courier that Harvard University was attempting to buy the Shakespearean collection, or at least parts of it. This report, which was reprinted with some concerned commentary in the Stratford Beacon, states that representatives of Harvard University have lately been negotiating, it is understood, to see if the famous Shakespearean library of J. Davis Barnett of Stratford can be secured for that great American seat of learning. It is rather curious that the finest Shakespearean library in Canada should be in a city no larger than Stratford and in the possession of a private citizen, yet such is the case. There is nothing like it in Canada, and it is scarcely rivaled in the United States in any private collection. Mr. Barnett has no need to sell, however, and takes his greatest pride in the growth of his library. Barnett's response to the Beacon about this Buffalo Courier article hints that he would prefer to donate his collection as a whole to McGill University or to Western. We know now where Barnett's books ended up, and we've begun to research what the provenance and significance of these books might be. But what we don't know is what effect the books and Barnett had during the 34 years that he lived in Stratford. Today, I will attempt to illustrate how Barnett helped, not single-handedly, but helped to build the cultural, intellectual, and even material grounds that led to the founding of the Stratford Festival by fostering what were called in the 19th century literary societies. As Heather Murray illustrates in Come, Bright Improvement, the Literary Societies of 19th Century Ontario, literary societies were not the book clubs of today. In the 19th century, a book club was a kind of pooling of financial resources to buy books. Literary societies were groups of people who formed circles to read and discuss books, but since books were expensive and scarce, the meetings would often involve a series of presentations on books by members or by invited scholars. And these presentations were then debated and discussed. The resulting discussions certainly concerned poetry and drama and fiction, yes, but Murray also illustrates that the term literary in the 19th century functioned as roughly a synonym for the liberal arts and encompassed things like history and biography and essays on ideas and so on. Moreover, the point of these literary societies was not simply to allow elites to read literature together, although that certainly happened, but rather to engage a broad swath of the population to reimagine their society through books. As Murray observes, the birth of a 19th century literary society was typically heralded by a pyrotechnic explosion of plans to develop museums and libraries and publications, to encourage agricultural and mechanical innovation and the arts, to undertake scientific research, and so on. Murray notes somewhat wryly that most of these ambitions went unrealized. However, Barnett's network had a pretty good track record. They took lead roles in the founding of the Stratford Public Library, the founding of the Riverside Park system, in which the Stratford Festival would eventually be founded, as well as in the construction of the Shakespearean Gardens, where the young Tom Patterson famously conceived his idea for the Stratford Festival. And so when I talk about the grounds, I mean both social, cultural, and physical or material. Most versions of this founding story of what is variously called the Stratford story or the story of the Stratford Miracle unfold as a kind of pastoral tale in which a teenager, young Tom, dreams of founding a Shakespeare Festival while he dawdles in Shakespearean gardens adjacent to his high school. In this pastoral setting, young Tom and his friends foresee a disaster for Stratford as its largest employer, the steam locomotive repair shops of the Grand Trunk Railway, later the Canadian National Railway, would seem to be becoming obsolete because the GTR and CNR would switch from steam power to diesel power and presumably take the locomotive shops with them. When the CNR shops do begin to close down early in the 1950s, and as you can see, it's a massive complex on the left there, and the city's largest employer, Patterson returns to Stratford from Toronto to realize his teenage dream of starting a Shakespeare Festival and to save his hometown from industrial ruin. In this rags to riches narrative, Patterson leverages a small grant from City Council to pursue his festival idea, and he manages, through a combination of luck and persistence, to enlist the British theatre director Tyrone Guthrie, designer Tanya Mozevich, and actors Alec Guinness and Irene Worth, as well as Canadian theatre talent such as William Hutt and young Timothy Finlay. Patterson's mission to bring Elizabethan high culture to a small Ontario town causes him to be mocked, we're told in The Stratford Adventure and other films on the subject. But he prevails against all financial odds. Indeed, the enduring charm of this narrative arises out of its combination of heroic ambition and comic execution. As Margaret Groom notes, the genesis of the Stratford idea in the imagination of Tom Patterson is a story long since elevated to the status of Canadian folklore and accorded genial nods and smiles at the charming naivety of it all. This folklore effectively pairs a kind of great man theory of history, featuring Guthrie prominently, transforming Stratford through the sheer force of his will and personality, with a kind of populist rags to riches tale in which the unsophisticated little guy, Patterson, prevails through a combination of guile and hustle. The Heritage Minute on the founding of the Stratford Festival encapsulates this dynamic in Patterson's awkward boast to Guthrie during a rehearsal for Richard III, which is disrupted by a train whistle. Chamber of Commerce guy said to me, "Patterson, Stratford has always been a railroad town." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm planning to change that." The debonair Guthrie resolves this whistle crisis, symbolic of the city's clash of industrial and cultural economies, by declaring that the play will have to start late to avoid the 8:05 for Toronto. The emphasis in this narrative then is on the radical transformation of the city via a dedicated group of talented cosmopolitans, Guthrie, Mosevich, Guinness, and some dogged locals such as Patterson, or the contractor Oliver Gaffney, who persists in building the festival even when he knows he's not going to get paid. Now, in many ways, Patterson Stratford really was a railway town. Tom was named after his grandfather, Thomas Patterson, who held the position as sort of chief foreman or superintendent at the newly created GTR shops from 1877 to 1888. And other members of the Patterson family joined Thomas at the GTR, including Harry Patterson, Tom's father, who was the last of the many family members to work at the shops, acting as superintendent from 1902 until 1905, when he quit to open a bookstore. What Tom Patterson neglects to mention in his memoir is that the man who supervised the GTR shops between Thomas Patterson and Harry Patterson, and the man who arguably first bridged the railway workers with the Shakespeare enthusiasts, was John Davis Barnett. So let us now turn to his story. Barnett was born in England in 1849 and moved to Canada as a teenager in 1866. His father, George, who eventually joined his son in Stratford, was a trained draftsman with experience in railway engineering, and he passed on this knowledge to his son, who otherwise had no higher education. Barnett began working in the drafting rooms of the GTR in Montreal, and he rose quickly through the ranks on the strength of his book learning, which gave him a lifelong interest in making sure that materials were available to others for self-directed study. Soon, Barnett was overseeing the drawings of the first steam locomotive produced in Canada. That's a kind of composite photo with Barnett on the left. But at the same time as Schofield's work on the accession books is demonstrated, and the accession books are the books in which Barnett records his and tries to organize his purchases a little bit after the fact. Barnett began collecting Shakespearean in his spare time in Montreal, including some of his most prized volumes. However, in 1880, Barnett moved to Stratford to accept a promotion to the rank of master mechanic at the GTR shops. And the move led to an explosion of purchases in 1881. Perhaps because of a raise in income, that might be why he's buying more books, or perhaps it's the spirit of his new hometown, which is named after the birthplace of Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. In 1884, Barnett moved away. He moved to Hamilton and did a stint with another railway there. And in these itinerant years, he seems to have sought what I'm calling literary society, mostly through a network of letter writing to international Shakespeare scholars. His letters from the 1880s reveal that he added rare volumes to the collections of the renowned Shakespeare, rare in the sense of hard to find, the renowned Shakespeare biographer and collector J.O. Halliwell Phillips, as well as donating books and pamphlets to the new Shakespeare Memorial Library in Stratford-upon-Avon. There's some letters of thanks to Barnett there. However, he also kind of sparred with the renowned Shakespeare editor, founder of the original Shakespeare Society in England, but also later disgraced forger J.P. Collier. And we're not exactly sure of the nature of this debate, but from our purposes, the most interesting of these letters is one that came from F.J. Furnivall, one of the founding editors of the Oxford English Dictionary and the founding director of the new Shakespeare Society in England, which ran from 1873 to 1894, and which sought to distance itself from its scandal-plagued predecessor by taking a more scientific approach to the study of Shakespeare. And this combination of science and Shakespearean obviously appealed to the young engineer Barnett. In addition, as Robert Sawyer illustrates, the Society took a more progressive approach to membership, and it encouraged participation by women, as well as developing a Sunday Shakespeare Society for working class individuals who could not make regular Friday meetings. This kind of outreach, as well as the Society's publication of more affordable reproductions of Shakespeare's folios and quartos, was precisely the kind of initiative that would interest Barnett more and more with each passing year. However, in the 1870s and 1880s, as Barnett's still moving around, the inspiration for what he often called his backwoods library seems to be a vision of the carefully curated library that he got from the American essayist and transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson in his essay on books. Indeed, in Barnett's unpublished lecture, Books That Influenced Me, he ranks Emerson's essays, in particular the essay on self-reliance, above Shakespeare's work as the strongest intellectual stimulus, the provocation to independence in thought and opinion when 17 or 18 and the broad Atlantic lay between me and the home of my school. Excuse me. Yet the public objectives of Furnival's Shakespeare Society would gradually modify the brazen American individualism of Emerson. Hence, the contents of Furnival's 1881 letter to Barnett deserve special attention for the more inclusive vision of literary society that they present. The letter is ostensibly about membership fees, but Furnival proceeds to say that, the society needs more money, in part because they've been savaged by A.C. Swinburne in his book, A Study of Shakespeare, through a wicked parody of the society's proceedings, and membership had gone into a rapid decline. So trying to drum up support for the society, Furnival writes in his almost illegible hand, "It is pleasant to know that we have a well-wisher in Stratford, in Canada, as well as in the state of Victoria, where an editor, Mr. P.A. Daniel, is now staying in Stratford, Australia. Can you not get up a Shakespeare reading club in your town and entice all its members to join our society? We want more money, sadly. All the Stratfords in our colonies ought to have a special Shakespeare library or bookcase in the free library of the town to keep up the connection with our Warwickshire birthplace. The Memorial Library there is to have a picture show this year, and the theatre a fortnight's series of performances. A set of our amateurs in London will perform the first quarto of Hamlet from 1603 for the first time since 1603, probably at St. George's Hall here on April 16th. Truly yours, FJF." Barnett, of course, rather exceeded Furnival's expectations by amassing one of the largest private collections of Shakespearean in North America, as well as becoming a leading advocate for public access to books in the emergent public library movement in Canada. His stance on the public library, which Josh alluded to in his introduction, is aptly summarized by the poster you can see behind me from the Barnett Legacy Project, where Barnett is quoted as saying, "Some care not for knowledge or care so far only as it can be used to bring money into their pockets. Others esteem knowledge much, but treat it as caviar, good for themselves and for their class only. Others believe in it and in its widest possible extension to race, class, and worker. These are the people who can be counted on to help in widening schools and increasing free libraries." So that's of interest to our larger discussion. But so in the context of this meditation on the Stratford Festival is the performance that Furnival mentions in the final paragraph of his letter, and that I didn't get to discuss when I cited this letter in a presentation for the Western Early Modern Society. It demands our attention. The landmark 1881 performance of the first quarto of Hamlet that Furnival mentions was directed by William Poole, the leading advocate of the open, non-illusionistic Elizabethan stage, in contrast to the picture frame or proscenium stage that was standard in the 19th century, which you can see in the middle of the photograph. As Robert Shaughnessy illustrates in his chapter-long section on the subject of performance in the Shakespeare effect, Poole's production of the pirated or incomplete first quarto of Hamlet, which Poole promoted as a kind of condensed actor's version of the play tailored to public performance, emerged as a response to the New Shakespeare Society's inexpensive reproduction of the first quarto of Hamlet, is the print text, which was the first in the Society's series of publications. Much as the New Shakespeare Society's photographic reproductions of early Shakespeare quartos and folios had made access to the originals feasible for a general audience, Poole aimed to revive the masterpieces of Elizabethan theatre upon the stage for which they were written, so as to represent them as nearly as possible under the conditions existing at the time of their first production. That's Poole quoted by Shaughnessy. The kind of uneasy collaboration between Furnival, the textual scholar, and Poole, the performance artist at St. George's Hall, received mixed reviews, however, and no professional theater adopted a permanent open stage until Tanya Mosevich and Tyrone Guthrie debuted the thrust stage of the Stratford Festival in 1953. Guthrie and Mosevich aimed to overthrow 2 centuries of theatrical conventions tailored to the proscenium stage by producing drama on, to quote Guthrie, a stage which closely conformed to what is known of the stage for which Shakespeare wrote, and by relating the audience of that stage to actors in a manner which approximated the Elizabethan manner. Guthrie and Mosevich developed their design ideas by studying the open stage theories of William Poole and Harley Granville Barker and George Bernard Shaw. And they didn't exactly pursue a kind of purist interpretation of period reconstruction, as Dennis Salter observes. They made use of Greek amphitheater seating and Roman vomitories, which are the alleyways that run down the middle of the audience, modern lighting infrastructure. So it wasn't by any means a purist production. But as I will show in the remainder of my presentation, the particular kind of Shakespeare tradition that Barnett cultivated in Stratford, one influenced by the activities of the New Shakespeare Society, fostered the kinds of social and intellectual conditions that would encourage the committee running the Stratford Festival Foundation in 1952 to embrace Guthrie's eccentric and very expensive proposal to put a permanent thrust stage inside a temporary tent in the middle of your best parkland. It's not obvious to endorse this. I think, indeed, we need to reconsider the boldness of this decision in 2021, when theaters such as Stratford and Shaw, with the benefit of multi-million-dollar operating budgets, the Canada Council, intergenerational and international networks of patrons, and so on, have made the admittedly bold move to do outdoor Shakespeare in tents on temporary wooden and steel platforms. Stratford in 1952, we must remember, had none of these supports. So what did it have? I hope to show today that it had a set of cultural expectations and institutional practices and a perception of local tradition that made the idea of a Shakespeare Festival both desirable and viable. So let's see how these institutions arose. When Barnett returned to Stratford in 1888 to oversee a massive expansion of the GTR shops in his new role as superintendent, he inherited a small technical library for railway engineers and mechanics, as well as a converted woodshed that housed the library and a classroom for the GTR's apprentice program. Barnett greatly expanded and diversified this technical library by adding titles on art and science and travel, as well as installing showers at the request of workers so that they would be more comfortable reading after a hard day's work. Book loans were tracked, and soon fiction titles greatly overshadowed all other loans. You can see out of 7,000 loaned in 1898, roughly 6,000 were fiction. And this might seem to defeat the whole purpose of the GTR's technical library, but it's clear that Barnett was trying to cultivate a loose sense of literary society among the railway workers, and he renamed the library the Grand Trunk Literary Institute. He subsequently used the Literary Institute as a platform for hosting public lectures on topics as varied as, and I know it's too small to read, but this article talks about Barnett's ideas for hospital design that he picked up at the Chicago World's Exposition and from his own library. And he promises that later on, the following week, he'll lecture on the latest in forestry equipment. It seems random, but the point is that the Literary Institute became a kind of forum for reimagining and modernizing the city and its institutions and its economy, as well as for broadening the education, particularly the humanities education, of what some writers call Railway Stratford. This GTR Literary Institute stood a stone's throw away from the current site of the University of Waterloo's Stratford School for International Business and Digital Design. And the aim of that institute is obviously to bridge the arts, sciences, and global business. I'm not aware of any particular emphasis on Shakespeare at the GTR Literary Institute, but Barnett would cultivate the specialization through a Shakespeare Society that operated, or club, that operated in Stratford in the late 1890s and early 1900s. This society resembled Furnival's Shakespeare Society in the topics that it broached, such as the proper sequence of Shakespeare's plays and the possible dates of their composition. The club's activities evidently guarded some public interest because its activities were occasionally reported in local newspapers, especially when there's a visiting scholar such as the Mr. Libby quoted here, who's running a lecture series. For example, the Shakespeare Club's influence was recollected years after its dissolution when a local debate arose concerning a Canadian tour by the F.R. Benson players of the Memorial Theatre in Stratford upon Avon. The tour began at London's Grand Theatre, and initially the Stratford papers were enthusiastic and they encouraged locals to make the trek to London to see the players. However, when it was announced that the Benson players would also perform in nearby St. Thomas, home of the rivals' CPR shops, the local Shakespeare enthusiasts, in particular Barnett's good friend W.S. Dingman, editor at the Herald, flew into a rage and demanded that the city compel the Benson Company to perform in Stratford first. It was a matter of local railway pride, but also, as the title of this article indicates, of vindicating our classic title. The nickname or moniker for Stratford prior to 1953, when it became known as the Festival City, was the Classic City. And it was necessary to vindicate the title of the Classic City to have these Benson players come and perform their dramas in Stratford before St. Thomas. My apologies to St. Thomas. Interesting, this notion of vindication is roughly the same expression that the Stratford Festival Foundation used to describe the genesis of the Shakespeare Festival in its picture book, The Stratford Story, which commemorated the Stratford's first season and is a frequent source for critics and critical commentary. This book features the introductory subheading, The Classic City That Had Yet to Justify Its Name, and then introduces the question, why, with no particular previous claim to cultural importance, should Stratford suddenly become the hub of such a project as a festival of Shakespeare? The answer that is supplied in the Stratford story is simply landscape, not any human Shakespearean precedent beyond a few place names and the Classic City moniker. Nonetheless, the enduring influence of the Shakespeare Club is encapsulated in the closing paragraph of the 1914 article, as it envisions a Benson performance in Stratford. It says, perhaps for the occasion, it might be practicable also to revive the Shakespearean Club, which tradition avers once did flourish in our classic city, in order to form somewhat of a center around which the preparations might suitably rally. On a smaller scale, Barnett also promoted the link between textual study and performance by displaying his books, by constructing book exhibitions at amateur theater performances. For example, this article commemorates a pageant of Shakespeare scenes and probably soliloquies performed by female students at the local Catholic convent, the Loretto Academy, in 1914. The newspaper article about this article concludes, to Mr. J.D. Barnett is due many thanks for affording us a peep at his literary clothesline. And there are other articles of this sort where Barnett displays his books as part of the theatrical performance. Another example of literary circles promoting public performance that is first noted by Murray in her book is the founding of the Chautauqua Circle in Stratford in 1895. Now, not much is known about the activities of Chautauqua in Stratford, but we know that these circles typically took a syllabus designed by a university instructor and organized a 4-year course of study around it that would result in a certificate from the Chautauqua Institute in New York State. Forming a Chautauqua Circle also carried the expectation that the circle would facilitate the traveling cultural events by other Chautauqua societies, such as the music concerts a Toronto chapter of Chautauqua organized in Stratford in 1889. I'm indebted to the festival studies scholar Wendy Reed for encouraging me to think about Chautauqua, because one of the major patrons of the Stratford Festival in its early years, Governor General Vincent Massey, was related on his mother's side to the prominent Methodist Bishop John Hale Vincent, co-founder of the Chautauqua Summer School in New York State. As Karen Finley illustrates in The Force of Culture, Vincent Massey and Canadian Sovereignty, Massey could be bitingly satirical of the religious origins of the society, and indeed he probably would have enjoyed the drag artist Pearl Harbor's Chautauqua, which was part of the unfortunately canceled 2020 season at Stratford. However, Finley also illustrates that Massey was absolutely committed to the society's cultural mission of bringing music, theater, and adult education to small towns and rural communities, which they did through traveling tent chautauquas. And that was a kind of system of touring performances. The Society also considered the civic design of Chautauqua, New York, with its lakeside cultural institutions, as a model to be emulated by other cities. No surprise then that Massey donated $10,000 to the Stratford Festival Foundation when the festival seemed poised to fail because it could not afford to pay its Chicago tent maker, nor that Massey laid the cornerstone of the permanent festival theater beside the river in 1957, nor that the festival theater won the Massey Gold Medal for Architecture in 1958. As for Barnett, who was a former Methodist circuit preacher in his youth, turned bardolator, he seems a pretty good candidate for this circle, but I haven't been able to ascertain whether he had any direct membership in it. Nonetheless, among his papers, we do find, for example, an instructional guide on how to organize Chautauqua circles, giving the example, the blank circle requests the pleasure of your presence at the observance of Shakespeare Memorial Day, April 23rd at blank, 8 o'clock. Another example in Barnett's papers is taken from the Chautauquan newsletter, which offers a sample program for Shakespeare Day that wittily uses lines from Shakespeare to announce and explain the program of events, which I've shown you here. So Barnett's work at the, through this kind of public literary engagement and through Barnett's work at the GTR Institute, he started to build a network of like-minded associates, in particular, R. Thomas Orr and Dr. E.H. Eit, who would play leading roles in two major public works in Stratford, the construction of the Stratford Public Library and the development of Stratford's Riverside Park System, the largest park system per capita in Canada. In the late 19th century, the province of Ontario passed laws making it possible to combine and convert local libraries, such as Mechanics Institutes and the reading room that was in the Stratford City Hall, into municipally funded public libraries. And the fact that City Hall burned down in Stratford in 1897 made the notion of a free library, a public library, even more urgent. Barnett joined forces with the architect and insurance agent R.T. Orr, then on the board of the Mechanics Institute, to spearhead a drive for a permanent public library, which became a reality in 1903. Orr wrote to the Carnegie Foundation in New York to win financial support for the library, which Carnegie was doing in the United States and was beginning to do in Canada. But local animosity to the union-busting railway baron meant that many Stratford taxpayers opposed taking what they called Carnegie's blood money. Barnett, however, vigorously supported the donation. It was Barnett, not Orr, who went to New York to negotiate the details of the donation with Carnegie. Barnett even ran for city council in 1902 when the Carnegie issue was a raging public debate. And Barnett's first order of business as an alderman was to select a library trustee and later helped to boost the Carnegie donation from $12,000 to $15,000 as part of the debates and discussions. Barnett also insisted that the city spend $800 to purchase land in the heart of the downtown, close to the high school and courthouse, instead of using cheaper land on the edge of town. Barnett's preferred location is roughly on the site of Stratford's first schoolhouse, run by the 19th century abolitionist J.J.E. Linton, publisher of The Voice of the Bondsman, an abolition newspaper that was recently in the news because we found the only extant print copy of it, or more specifically, I think the archivist at Western and Alyssa McLean helped to find this document. And I draw attention to this find, which now figures prominently in the research of Alyssa McLean and Mary Helen McMurrin in their Shirk-funded project, Tracing Black Lives in Print, 1780 to 1880, to emphasize that although Patterson's memoir depicts him making somewhat serendipitous use of seemingly random local cultural materials, these materials were in fact designed and fought for by people like Barnett, who had a particular aesthetic vision of the city grounded in their understanding of civic history. For example, Patterson's first major initiative in launching the festival is to travel to New York with a small grant from City Council and to try to recruit the great Shakespearean actor Sir Lawrence Olivier to Stratford. This plan fails quickly and utterly. Faced with the prospect of a humiliating defeat, Patterson resorts to his plan B, which he describes in his memoir. Shortly before I had left for New York, I'd gone to the Stratford Public Library and read the annual reports of various foundations in the United States, the Carnegie, the Rockefeller, and so on. I went through the list of officers of each, and I picked out those who looked like they might be in a position to help me. I gathered my festival-related clippings from newspapers in Canada and went off to the Carnegie Foundation. Now, the Carnegie Foundation rejected them. The Rockefeller Foundation wasn't too enthusiastic, although Patterson later reported them to be. But my point is that Patterson effectively mimics the campaign led by Barnett and Orr in his New York trip, and he explicitly makes use of the resources they put in place to achieve his goals. So Patterson later reiterates, "Thank God for the annual report of the Rockefeller Foundation in the Stratford Library." A more, I think, crucial example comes through the Parks Board. In 1904, Orr, Barnett, Dr. Eit, and other leading citizens migrated directly from their library project to a campaign to develop a continuous park system along the river that would eventually become the site of the original Festival Theater and the new Tom Patterson Theater. For example, as president of the new Fortnightly Club, which was a kind of successor to the Shakespeare Club and was later renamed the Arts and Letters Club, Barnett in 1905 hosted a meeting at his home to deliver a lecture to the club on the ennobling effects of landscape design at a time when the construction of the park system was still a matter of intense local debate. And he used images of landscape paintings from his book collection to illustrate the argument. The record of this meeting exists, unfortunately, only in notes kept by Sarah Orr, RT's sister, and in a short newspaper article. However, no sooner had this dream begun to take shape in the park system than the land became the object of successive bids by the Canada Pacific Railway to claim the north and or south shores of the river system for rail lines and a CPR station. The CPR bids were endorsed by Stratford's mayor and its leading businessmen, and local lore portrays Orr as somewhat single-handedly defending the park system against these corporate incursions. Notably, however, several members of the Fortnightly Club, including the Dingmans and McLaughlins, the major furniture manufacturers in town, were opponents of the CPR bid and donors of land and money to the Parks Board. For example, Leach recalls in Flood Tides of Fortune that Barnett was a strong parkland supporter, and he tried to resolve the CPR predicament by proposing a union station for the CPR and GTR lines at the southern edge of town. However, as a former GTR employee and shareholder, he was accused of a conflict of interest. Angrily, Leach recalls, Barnett offered to give his GTR stock to the city, providing that some other citizen or citizens would make a similar matching gift. The money was to be used for parks or the library or the hospital and be kept as a source of income. Barnett had no takers on this offer or dare. Subsequently and more quietly, from 1907 to 1910, Barnett combined his aesthetic and engineering interests as water commissioner, overseeing the development of a state-of-the-art water filtration system for Stratford's drinking water, and overseeing it from the elegant building that is now Gallery Stratford, adjacent to the Stratford Festival. Eventually, the Water, Light, and Electricity Commissions amalgamated into one public utilities agency, which Barnett headed in 1910, and which facilitated Stratford's transition from water power to electricity coming from Niagara Falls, thereby moving industry away from the Avon River and making the river available for parks and cultural institutions, such as the Normal School or Teachers College that was founded there in 1908. Thus, Barnett played a pivotal role in the development of some of Stratford's most important physical infrastructure, and through an interesting coincidence, he became honorary co-president of the London Canadian Club, with the driving force behind this regionally transformative hydroelectric plan, the former London Mayor, Sir Adam Beck. By 1915, the aging Barnett began to withdraw from civic affairs to pursue one last great literary project. In addition to his Shakespearean collection, he now possessed a vast collection and diversified library with significant holdings in Canadian and American history, Canadian and American literature, the history of engineering and medicine, and so on. This collection required a permanent home that would outlive him, and he began corresponding with the top federal bureaucrat, a local boy actually, Dr. Adam Short, about nationalizing his collection. Dr. Short responds to Barnett's proposal with the following missive. I have just received your letter of yesterday, which I have read with interest. I shall be very pleased to talk over your problem with reference to placing of your valuable collection of books in a proposed national library and their proper housing before such a library might be in a condition to receive them. I would be free to talk almost any day within the next 2 weeks. Barnett continued to apply pressure on the federal government to realize his library idea by publishing his proposal to create a national library for Canada in the Ontario Library Review in May of 1918. Such a federal service was desperately needed, as a 1933 report, Libraries in Canada, makes clear. Though one can find books, it says, there is no real library service in most of Canada, and nearly 80% of the people in Canada have nothing that could, by any stretch of the imagination, be called a proper library service of any kind, especially in rural areas. However, Ottawa did not heed Barnett's call, and a few months later, he donated his library to Western. As for the National Library idea, it was shelved until after the Second World War, when the Massey Commission on Arts and Letters deemed the absence of such a library a national disgrace. The founding of the National Library of Canada in 1953, the same year as the founding of the Stratford Festival, remains one of those uncanny coincidences that surround Barnett criticism. Meanwhile, in Stratford, the forces that Barnett helped to set in motion continued to pave the way toward the Stratford Festival. For example, a few years after Barnett's death, R.T. Orr donated the riverside land from the family's old water-powered lumber mill to create a riverside bandshell in a natural amphitheater by the river. It was the first bandshell of its kind in Canada based on a design that Orr had seen in his travel in the United States. And Orr intended the venue to facilitate musical and theatrical performances. It became principally associated with Stratford's popular amateur music festival. But importantly, Patterson's original idea for the Stratford Festival was to use this stage as the basis of his Shakespeare Festival. Guthrie dismissed the idea quickly because of its lack of side entrances and dressing rooms and so on. Nonetheless, Patterson, in his memoir, clearly venerates Orr as a civic leader, and he claims somewhat hyperbolically that he will found his church on Orr's rock. Patterson, nonetheless, unfairly severs Orr's connection to the festival in a subsequent passage where he quotes an oft-cited anecdote about Orr worrying that tourists were going to trample his grass in a kind of fire festival catastrophe. Orr, however, did not oppose the idea of the festival. The name R. Thomas Orr Esquire appears among the elite patrons listed on the title page of the Stratford Festival's 1953 catalog, alongside the likes of Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent and Lady Eaton. Moreover, as the first president of the Festival Foundation, Dr. Showalter recalls, when he undertook the festival project, he learned from old-timers that there had been a similar idea suggested around 1930, he says. Whether the conception of it was the same, I don't know. The person who told me that, among others, was old Harry Strudley, a local industrialist and parks advocate. I went to him early on in the game, and sure enough, they had thought about a festival at that time. Likewise, a 1940 article in the Winnipeg Free Press called The Stratford Tradition updates these ambitions for Shakespearean performance in the post-Depression era. In this article, Grant Dexter tells readers that if they're worried about the bombing of Stratford upon Avon in England, they can take solace in the fact that its sister city in Canada has been building Shakespeare-related infrastructure for decades. Dexter's article asserts that the connection with Shakespeare's hometown is the biggest thing there is in Stratford, Ontario. Succeeding generations have maintained the tradition. Each year, the normal school students put on one of the plays. Shakespeare is more widely read here than in any other town in the country. The library bears witness to this fact. Now, I can't verify any of these claims, but it is notable that at the end of this article, probably citing Orr, Dexter says, there is talk in town today of converting a local theater into a proper Shakespearean house. By founding the Stratford Festival in 1953, which in the 1960s would incorporate the aforementioned Avon Theater, Patterson fulfilled an establishment dream, as it were, the dream of Orr and others to build a dedicated Shakespeare theater. I make this point not to diminish Patterson's legacy. Patterson was full of innovative ideas, as I've tried to show elsewhere through my research on the music and film festivals established in Stratford. However, as theorists of festival studies and the creative economy agree, you cannot create lasting and successful cultural festivals and institutions out of nothing. They require a local cultural basis, or a so-called soft infrastructure of human expertise, enthusiasms, and organizing networks. Stratford is now the city with the highest rate of arts-related employment per capita in Canada, but if we're to understand Stratford as more than simply a location where Guthrie and his successors managed to stage some Shakespeare plays, and if Stratford is to diversify its artistic productions in new directions, then a thoroughgoing account of Stratford's cultural activity is required. Likewise, post-colonial critiques of the Stratford Festival in the Shakespeare tradition need a better historical basis because they generally take Patterson's account of Stratford's nullity prior to 1953 for granted, and thus misconstrue the actual processes of local settler culture. Figures such as Barnett and Orr developed a complicated combination of Canadian and Shakespearean enthusiasms, and we are only beginning to understand the breadth and complexity of this process. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you, Josh, for having me.
Wow, what a rich talk. As we've gone through the process of organizing this webinar series and talking about the Barnett collection, I am just so astounded by the intellectual energy radiating from this house held up by books. And your talk did so much in terms of navigating through that process. I am going to open the floor to questions. So please do enter your questions in the Q&A box that's there. We have one that's already waiting in queue. So as you're thinking about some potential questions, I'm going to start off with the question that we have here from Sheila, who has asked the question, where did Barnett source out the books he purchased?
That's an interesting question. Thank you, Sheila. It's interesting because book collecting was essentially a rich man's game. It was, the J.P. Morgans and others and Folgers who are oil and railway barons who were doing these things. And Barnett was affluent in small town terms, but he wasn't rich. And so effectively he was making use of a lifetime free railway pass that he had through his railway work to travel all over Eastern North America to secondhand bookstores. And he was using his small extra capital to buy secondhand books, and then also to take treasures that he had that he found that were not necessarily interesting to him or duplicates of what he already had. And then he would go on book sharing and book exchange sites to exchange those books. So, I mean, he's essentially playing a rich man's game with a beer budget.
Absolutely brilliant. I have a note here in the chat from Alyssa, whose research you mentioned. I'm just going to read it out because I think it's just a great note and also demonstrates the collaboration that's going on right now in terms of looking at the Barnett collection. Alyssa says, thanks, Ian, for the talk. While I'm honored that Ian thinks so highly of me, I need to clarify Scott Schofield is the one who found the voice of the bondsman with Western librarians. So I think there's probably an energy that's going around the collection right now that makes these finds possible. So I think maybe
Scott, I owe you one.
Yeah. Maybe there's all sorts of connections there. Maybe leads me to a question potentially here too. One of the things I'm so struck by is the conditions of possibility that were set by this collection of books. The number of things that you've outlined that had their genesis in this man and his collection, and the networks that literally in terms of the railway, but also figurative networks that he forged. I'm thinking now that we're doing an investigation, we're doing a webinar series around the collection, which is another of these conditions of possibility for our conversation. What would be one of the things that you would love to see coming out of a reinvestigation of the Barnett collection? What new conditions of possibility are there that your research is opening up from the collection?
Well, since this is a Public Humanities at Western talk, I mean, I think one thing we need to realize is that when Barnett donated his library to Western in 1918, it came with a series of provisions that you mentioned on the availability of these books to be loaned by anyone, anywhere in Canada, any diligent student. And you didn't have to be a university student, just anyone with access to a local library that would be in charge of the lending. And thus, what we need to realize is that although a National Library of Canada was founded in 1953, a National Library for Canada, which was the title of the Barnett article from 1918, was effectively established in London at Western in 1918. He used Western as a platform for his National Library idea, which involves a lot of interlibrary loans to remote rural areas. And so we need to a certain extent honor that legacy, but also celebrate that legacy, because this is a major thing in the book world, and in anyone interested in the information economy or a creative economy. I think this is London's grand leap onto a national stage, and so that's realizing that and celebrating that would be important. But I think if the Barnett collection was foundational, especially to the Arts Library as it was, it should be in some way materially celebrated or replicated in that way. Like, why not use the basement of Weldon to collect the most interesting specimens from the Barnett Library and have them available to students and on display and so on. I think there are lots of innovative ideas, and we're always under library construction anyway. There's something that could be done to, in a very concrete way, and in the spirit of Barnett's objectives, celebrate that legacy.
Great, terrific. We have a question here. This might be one of our librarians could help you with this too, but I'm sure given the fact that you would be itching to get in to see the books, the question is, given the pandemic restrictions, can students access these books?
Well, that's an interesting question, yes. So everyone could access Barnett's books because they were simply on the shelves until fairly recently. He insisted on keeping them in the stacks. Now, the library has begun a kind of deselection process that began to thin out the stacks and send some of the books in the stacks to the Downsview repository. And members of the English department at Western were very active in making sure that Barnett's books did not go to Downsview. And so they've been accorded a medium rare status, which acknowledges their importance within the collection. So yes, they should all be at Western. They should be accessible. Many of them, however, have now migrated over to special collections, and you can only get into special collections by making an appointment, but it is possible.
Great. We have a comment here, which also I think is wonderful to read out because of the context of this. Thank you so much for this very interesting and elucidating talk. I had done some research on the founding of the festival, and Mr. Barnett's name was now noticeably absent. This is definitely all new food for thought. Thanks for the valuable work. Actually, let's pose that into a question. Have you had conversations with Stratford about the influence of Barnett? Is this something that do you think they're aware of, or is this something that that they might actually be surprised as well?
I think some of my essays have circulated. One interesting development I'm aware of is I was going to the Stratford Festival archives, which is an amazing facility on Douro Street where Barnett used to live. Making use of some of their resources, and I got talking about this guy Barnett. I mean, has anyone read Barnett? And I actually sent one of my early presentations and essays on Barnett to the head archivist there, who shortly afterwards was actually approached by an anonymous donor who had some remaining books by Barnett and some documents that were of great use to me. And she at that time had never heard of Barnett, and it was only through my small intervention that she accepted this donation. So I think there is a kind of burgeoning awareness, but as I said, no, Stratford, for reasons that are totally a mystery to me, doesn't seem to latch on to Barnett for very long. There are people who sort of raise the issue and then it just dies away.
Right, and that we have a note in the chat here from Teresa, who says the archives are open by appointment to all students, staff, and faculty. So if we do have students who are watching who are energized by Ian's talk to go in and actually look at some of the works, you can actually go in and look at the collection, which links to a comment by Rebecca too. Some are also being or have been digitized, like The Voice of the Bondsman. Has a lot of the work that informs your talk been digitized, or was this a lot of going in and getting your elbows deep into the archives?
That's a good question. I kind of went about this in a backwards way, and I'll say it's backwards because Scott is doing it in a much more forthright way, and I applaud him for doing so. The right way to do this is to go to the accession books and then work your way methodically through all the accession books. I was fascinated by the idea of Barnett as a kind of forgotten figure who, because he was a collector not only of books but of newspaper articles and magazine articles, and there's these things called the Barnett bundles that weigh 5 tons that he donated to Western and eventually made their way to the National Archives. I wanted to go through those things first. I wanted to see what mysteries might be in the bundles. And so, although obviously, like anyone at Western, I've encountered Barnett's books and his book plate. Right. Anyone who spent serious time in the library, I first started going to Ottawa and combing through these materials. And so a lot of the newspaper articles that I posted there are actually newspaper articles that Barnett clipped himself. And are part of the legacy now at the LAC, Library and Archives Canada.
Right, brilliant. I have a question here from Alicia Robinet, who you mentioned in your talk. Alicia asks, can you talk more about the, and she's putting quotation marks because I note this phrase too, I actually thought this was really interesting, soft infrastructure and local networks in which Barnett was involved, and if Barnett talked about the distinction between collecting Shakespeareana and local Canadian literature.
I unfortunately don't have any information on the latter question. What was the beginning of the question? Sorry.
The beginning of the question is, can you talk more about soft infrastructure, and the local networks in which Barnett was involved?
So soft infrastructure is just an idea that comes out of festival studies and creative economy research that says, yes, there's physical infrastructure, which is the theater or you know, the arena or what have you, wherever you're going to have your spectacle or your performance. And cities can go and spend a lot of money building physical infrastructure, and then donors will always line up for physical infrastructure. But you risk throwing money at the wind if you don't have a kind of broad base of human support and different kinds of human expertise to support the functioning of that physical infrastructure, and that's what they call soft infrastructure. So when you look at Stratford, I mean, something as simple as the restaurant industry. The restaurant industry is there, and it's partly physical, yes, but it's there to service tourists who are going to the festival and so on. But it gradually builds up into an industry of its own, an attraction of its own, that even when the theater was shut down, people were still going to the restaurants. And then networks build up between these mutually dependent businesses, between the theater types and the restaurant people, that lead to collaborations, lead to cabarets, lead to informal performances, lead to young playwrights, you know, testing out a scene from something they're writing in a bar late at night. And so there's lots of interesting smaller stuff that happens in these creative economies that's difficult to map if you're only looking at the buildings. And so soft infrastructure tries to find a way of mapping or describing these networks.
Right, and it also, and sometimes contextualizes the way in which we focus on the big idea of Patterson's big idea. But those ideas are only made possible by all of those connectivities that you're talking about. So that's a really helpful way to think through this. And actually, I could maybe link this on to a comment into a question in the chat from Lorraine. Thank you for this fascinating talk. The artist Mary Healy, who painted Barnett's portrait, is a fascinating character in her own right. She was an accomplished portrait and landscape artist who had trained in England and who came to London to live with her brother, who was in ill health. Healy herself was a diabetic who was tragically took her own life in 1923. She also was a friend and an artistic mentor of Frederick Banting, the tie there too. Big idea in London. During his time in London, can you, or did you come across any personal papers that shed any light on the painting of his portrait by Healy?
No, I did not. Although there may be research at Gallery Stratford precisely because they were displaying that portrait and trying to contextualize it. It was actually an exhibition on 19th century British painting, although that's not a 19th century portrait. Um, the interest of that anecdote to me and that information, which I'm very grateful for, is that it highlights the very interdisciplinary nature of these sort of cultural communities. I mean,
Right.
Banting himself had an arts degree, if I remember correctly, in his undergrad. And like many medical people in the day, he was very interested in the humanities. Another Canadian example is Sir William Osler, whom Barnett met in England and was the honorary chair of the Classic Society at Oxford, as well as the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford, and a proud Canadian at the same time. And so a lot of these people emerged from the same sort of Southern Ontario self-taught small town milieu. And when you're in those smaller milieus, you tend to meet people of different backgrounds, and you build these alliances. So I think it's fascinating that Banting and Healy were friends. Banting was also a painter.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't surprise me that they would cross paths. The difficult part is mapping those interactions and trying to, through fragments, reconstruct these dynamics. But that's in part what Scott and I and Alicia and Blake Robinson have begun to do. First, we need to know what the books are, but when we open the books, Scott keeps finding dedications and inserted letters and annotations that highlight the fact that there are, these different connections between, for example, Whitman enthusiasts and Barnett, and the development of the library at Western.
Right, yeah, and Richard Maurice Buck in that mix as well as another one of those London figures. Just as a note of aside for people who are interested, eventually at the Words Festival this year, we are going to be doing an event on Banting because it's the 100th anniversary this year of the discovery of insulin. So we're going to be doing something. So keep your eyes peeled for an event that will talk a little bit about the local history there. We have a comment question from James Purkis, but in the note, MJ reveals that she is actually in disguise as James. So this is a question for MJ. Do you have membership lists from the Literary Society at Stratford? I'm curious about the gender balance and maybe also class. Was this initiative something particularly taken up by women or working class citizens? Was it instead a rich person's club?
That's an interesting question, and I'm still learning on this. If you go to Murray's book, she emphasizes really that it wasn't just a rich man's phenomenon, in the sense that there were literary societies for escaped African American slaves, for example, in the Chatham area. There were working class societies. There were groups like at the GTR that were meeting after a hard day's labor. And then there were, in the case of the Fortnightly Club, it's certainly the local elite that Barnett's kind of worked his way up into. That said, it's often the wives of the elite that are in these clubs. And to what extent they're going home and reporting on the activities, I'm not exactly sure. I kind of took some of those connections as a given in my talk today, but they need to be worked out a little bit more. When I went researching for the Chautauqua Association, I was there is a certificate that's often issued if you complete the Circle's course. And I contacted the archivists and alumni association of the Chautauqua Institute in New York. And they don't have complete lists of graduates, so they can't say for certain whether or not Barnett was in there, but the one archivist did note to me it was usually women. So she's not sure if this would have been for Barnett. So I think there was a fair gender balance. The class balance, I think, would probably be a bit uneven still. I think it still favored the elite.
Great. I have a comment here from Scott Schofield, also somebody who's come up in your talk. And it's a comment, but I'm going to read it out to you and maybe get some reflections on Scott's remarks here. I have also had many one step forward, three step back moments in my research on Barnett. The truth is there are so many ways into this collection. Ian's work has been invaluable in providing essential context for a rather obsessive interest in Barnett's books. You need the archival bits, you need the books, but you also need to understand the historical Stratford and Barnett's collection to the place and beyond. Thanks again, Ian, for sharing so much I didn't know. Wonderful stuff. So maybe you could reflect on some of Scott's description of his own experience of researching these books.
Well, that's interesting. So Scott and I started doing this independently and at roughly the same time.
Right.
And we got put together, fortunately, by one of my colleagues, the eminent Shakespeare scholar, Paul Werstein.
Right, who's here today. Yep.
Who's here today. Hi, Paul. And I think the diversity of our approaches, I mean, I was interested, I'm writing a cultural history of Stratford. I'm interested, obviously, in the Stratford Festival, but I'm a Canadianist. So I'm interested in sort of local cultural activity, and in particular literary and dramatic activity in this particular milieu that I was trying to use as a case study, precisely because it's a formative case study for mid-20th century Canadian arts and arts funding and council formation and so on. So I wanted to, as a Canadianist, understand that. Scott is trained in bibliography and in rare books and things like that, and he understands all sorts of things about bindings and stuff that I know nothing about. So our talents and interests are really mutually complementary. I don't have quite the obsessive methodological instinct that would lead me all the way through 42,000 books or even 1,200 items of Shakespearean, but Scott does. And so I think our respective different approaches is actually what I've been talking about. It's like people independently pursuing a shared interest, but having totally different approaches that when they combine them, yield fruitful results. And so there are lots of instances where Scott has also explained something that should be really simple that I didn't understand because I'm working with all these fragmented newspaper clippings and newspaper profiles by Fred Landon of Barnett. And so they say general things, but Scott can actually go, oh yeah, that's this book.
Right.
And that's invaluable.
Brilliant. We have a question from Mark Tovey, who has been an extraordinary figure of public history in our community, and has a wonderful public history question too, related to the work he's done on the Cronin Observatory. So the question is, have you seen any instances of artifacts, as opposed to books, collected by Barnett, or especially lists of collected artifacts that he might have made? At the Cronin Observatory, we have an artifact which contains the handwritten inscription, quote, from the collection of John Davis Barnett, unquote. Our sense is that anyone who collects so many books, this is true, likely would not collect a single artifact, and there may well be other artifacts that he collected with similar inscriptions.
My suspicion is that he collected Shakespeareana, but even in that quote I read about the lecture to the Fortnightly Club about parks, he was using pictures of landscape and landscape design from his own private collection. And I don't know, frankly, what happened to those pictures. Barnett did have a niece who moved to Canada and married into one of the prominent local families. He was close friends with Dr. Maisie Macklin, who was one of the early female physicians in Ontario. And Barnett's niece married into the Macklin family, and actually Macklin was part of the Fortnightly Club, and eventually the niece performed music to the Fortnightly Club as well. So some of those artifacts may have made their way into family collections elsewhere. I'm not really sure. But no, generally we're having such a hard time just keeping track of the books and the bundles that we haven't really done an inventory of artifacts.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that you've highlighted in your talk that I find very fascinating too, as somebody who organizes a festival, is the relationship between book collections and festival studies. In your research, have you seen other festivals that have had their condition of possibility being collections like this, or is this a really uniquely Barnett thing, where a collection like this has inspired something that turned into a festival like Stratford?
I would have to think about that. I would like the answer to be yes. I can't think of anything offhand, but maybe people in the chat would. The one thing I'll say about festival studies and even my brief forays into economics and the creative economy and stuff like that is that it is an important corrective to the way in which we usually think about things like canon formation and literary studies. We're so addicted to sort of linear chains of influence, and I realize I'm culpable of trying to give you a chronology today of Barnett's evolution. We're so addicted to these kind of chains of influence in literary studies that we don't always have the language to discuss something as dynamic as a kind of cultural ecology, which is what I was looking at today. Whereas in festival studies or in creative economy economics, they are interested in the way in which various stakeholders with very, very different objectives find ways of collaborating and essentially establishing truces over something like a festival. I mean, there are the corporate sponsors, and then there are the purists, and then there are the volunteers who just want an opportunity to socialize, and then there are the textual scholars who are angry about cuts in the performance, and in festival studies, they look at a festival more as a kind of war zone, really, where all these contesting claims on the festival occur. And I find that kind of interdisciplinary exploration very useful in breaking out of my own habits of thought in literary studies.
Right. Yeah, that's a really fascinating point in terms of how we adjust and adapt our methodologies to look at something like this. There's a question actually that dovetails actually quite nicely into that notion of the conflict. Did any of Barnett's heirs challenge the donation of his valuable collection to an institution?
No, I think if they knew anything about Barnett, they knew this was his lifelong project. And he left not on one of the interesting questions that does concern his estate is that he donated his 42,000 books in 1918. He died in 1926. He suffered a stroke and so was immobilized for many of those years. But if you're a person who's collected a book and 3/4, as he calculated, for every day of your life, then do you really stop buying books? Do you really stop collecting books just because you've made this donation? Now, I mean, he was busy in the early years cataloging the books, and so maybe he was exhausted merely from the act of trying to catalog the collection, or at least organize it. It's possible that he may have stopped entirely, but his obituary in the Globe, for example, pegs the number at 50,000 books. And so it's very possible that there were more books that were part of Barnett's final years. He did, however, leave his entire estate to Western for the construction of the library. That was the big project at the time, and for the stocking of the library. And so I think that would be a fairly clear-cut will. That's
yeah.
But I mean, it can't be forgotten that the collection is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, Barnett lived in a very modest home that was to a certain extent falling down and alarming to some of his visitors. As everyone who ever visited there noted, that the books were worth the whole block. Like, he could have just bought all sorts of things. So there would be a temptation to try and monetize the collection, but it would be a betrayal of his life's work.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that Scott spoke about in his first talk for our series was he mentioned that Barnett, I believe I have this right, would have been the first caretaker or librarian of these books at Western too. So he had the ability to kind of set the tone for how Western was going to deal with them.
Yeah. And it also forced the hiring of the first arts librarian at Western. So the systematization was both Barnett himself and the new librarian. It also precipitated a series of successive donations. And so leading elites, including the Somervilles, who helped to broker the donation, also left their private libraries to Western. So there's this movement from private to public that is in some ways stimulated by Barnett's example. And so Menina Jones, for example, was talking about the Blackburn donation, the Blackburn family closely connected to the London Free Press, and Grace Blackburn being an eminent writer and dramatist and theater critic in her own right. She was part of this new London circle that he was forming, and she left many of her Canadian titles to Western as well. And so again, you can't attribute all of that to Barnett. I mean, but there is a kind of effect. There's a kind of network effect that we need to note at least.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've exhausted the questions in our chat, and I'm mindful of the time that we're coming up to a half hour after. So this is really wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you everybody who joined us over your lunch hour and a bit into your afternoon on a Friday. I can see the sun kind of peeking in and out, and also in with Ian too. So hopefully we'll have a nice weekend. To put on another note on your radar, and it also dovetails really nicely with the point that Ian just made. Our next talk that's going to come up at the Words Festival, and it's also a collection that was donated to Western. There's a former professor, Eddie Smet, who gave thousands of comic books to Western libraries. And we're going to have Eddie talking about his collection at the Words Festival this year, which is going to come up to the 5th to the 14th of November. It will be a virtual event, so something to look at. You can check out our social media, Facebook or Twitter, for updates on what we're going to be doing with the webinar series. If everybody were able to, I'm sure they would be applauding you with ovations, Ian, for such a wonderful talk. Thanks to Ian's students for coming.
Sorry, I went over time.
Yes. Thanks to everybody who's joining. This is what we need to be doing, is having conversations about our collection, because you can see from someone like Barnett the amount of energy that comes when you look at a collection of books as a source of inspiration for a community to mobilize around, which is exactly what we're doing at the Barnett collection. So thank you, Ian, very much. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Great. Thank you all.